Greetings, fellow Kerbonauts! Welcome back to Kerbal Space Program. My name is Rice. I am a KSP Minimalist, and this is the Minimalist Space Program. So in our ongoing quest to conquer the stars in true minimalist fashion, that is with less parts and lighter vehicles, we made a quick trip to the Mun last episode to scout out a location for one of our future Mun bases. So now we begin stage 2 of our endeavor, and that is establishing a series of space stations around the Mun. So here are our objectives. We start out with 2 initial types of space stations that we'll be establishing this episode. The first one being a fuel depot, and the second being a transit space station. Now what we have here is the heaviest, but fortunately the simplest of our stations, and that's the fuel depot. Weighing in at about 22 tons and carrying only 6 parts, this is probably going to be the most optimized thing we'll be putting into orbit around the Mun. Now ultimately, the Mun is going to have about 4 space stations. Now you're probably asking yourself, why do we have 4 space stations? Why not just do 1 station that does it all? Well, the point of the Minimalist Space Program is to simplify things, and that's to decrease part load and decrease weight. In order to do that, we do a little technique called space station decentralization. Now what does that mean? Well, when you have a space station that does everything, it houses habitat for the Kerbonauts, it provides fuel, it provides a transit depot for all the vehicles. Well, ultimately you end up with a space station that has tons and tons of parts and is extremely heavy. Not to mention complicated. And next thing you know, it'll wreak havoc on your frame rates and generally slow down your game, and then things stop being fun. And we want to try to steer away from that. So we do a thing called decentralization, where we steer away from a space station that does everything and more towards a series of specialized space stations, each space station that does one specific job really well. So we're going to have a space station that specializes in refueling vehicles, and that'll be our fuel depot. We're going to have a transit station that'll hold all our vehicles. We're going to have a habitat station, and maybe one more station to add on, probably a close survey space station that'll orbit really close to the surface of the Mun. Now, when you send up space stations that are going to carry a permanent manned presence, it's always a good idea to send them up unmanned first. Generally, you want to build the house and then occupy them with your Kerbonauts. Because let's face it, as minimalists and as space designers in general, we are always obsessed with optimizing our spacecraft. We always need to add one more piece or remove a couple pieces in order to make it simpler and easier to use. And oftentimes, well, at least for me, I sometimes find myself deleting spacecraft or replacing spacecraft. And if there's Kerbonauts inside them already, well, that tends to complicate things. You have to go through the whole process of moving your Kerbonauts or bringing them back to Kerbin and then resending up the vehicle again. And that removes that extra step when you send vehicles up into space without the Kerbonauts initially. Also, it allows for that margin of safety too, in case you accidentally crash your vehicle onto the planet's surface. And after all, I'm pretty sure the Kerbals appreciate it too. Besides, who wants to sit in a tiny space closet for months on end while we wait to add additional modules to an otherwise unfinished house in space? Now we've parked our fuel depot at about 50 kilometers above the surface, which will make it the second farthest station to orbit the Mun. The farthest is going to be the habitat station. Now, as you can see, we've got that engine attached to our fuel depot via that docking port there. Additionally, we've got one mod that we're playing with in this game here, and that is the quantum struts. Now, I'm not a big fan of mods usually, with the exception of the Kethane mod. But one of the mods that I find pretty valuable is the quantum struts. I do like to dock things, and I am not a big fan of watching things wiggle around, especially when I start building large stations or transit stations, or generally transit vehicles that we send towards other planets. So those quantum struts, definitely Gonga. Absolutely love them. And now, for those of us who aren't fans of Kessler syndrome, it's time to get rid of that engine. So we check to make sure the fuel tank is full, and then we detach. And now, let's move us slowly away. Now, unfortunately, I don't have any RCS thrusters here, so I've just got to edge my way through and just give a small burst of the engine. You don't want to burst too hard, otherwise the tank is going to catch the backblast and you'll accidentally send it tumbling. Now we're going to switch around and turn us to retrograde, where we start our burn. And what we're going to do is we are going to send this bit of space trash right into the mun, making sure that the space around the mun stays as clean as possible. After all, even though the chances are small, we wouldn't want to end up crashing into a piece of space debris and regretting it later. Now next up, we've got our transit station, carrying 26 parts and weighing in at almost 13 tons. This transit station will carry all of our shuttles, it'll also dock our landers, and essentially it'll serve as just a big space parking lot. Now notice that big RCS tank perched precariously on docking ports on top of that space station. It's essentially its own module, and the reason why it's there is because it's another one of our amazing strategies we use to help minimize part counts and minimize weight. How, you might ask? Well, generally, when we design shuttles or we design landers with the intent of those vehicles docking eventually to some space station or docking to some other craft, we have a tendency to add the essentials, of course, and the essentials being an RCS tank and maybe 4 RCS thrusters. That equates to 5 additional parts that we add to our lander and or our shuttles. Now, if we design, say, a transit station that has its own little docking tug, then we don't need to design shuttles and landers with their own RCS capabilities, but rather, we have that shuttle or that lander approach the transit station, we detach the docking tug, and have that docking tug fly over to the lander or the shuttle, attach to it, and then tug it all the way to the transit station, and then use that docking tug to dock that vehicle onto the station itself. This is pretty helpful, especially when you plan to drop your landers, say, onto your mun base, because it keeps your landers as simple as possible. And especially when you take into consideration that mun bases have a tendency to be fairly complicated sometimes with a lot of part counts, and the fact that the mun base also has to render the ground underneath the base and the surrounding area, you could have frame rate issues, and those 5 extra parts that you don't need to have can sometimes make a whole lot of difference. Alright, so now that we've got our parking orbit set at 20 kilometers above the mun, what we're going to do next is we're going to transfer all the fuel that we can over to the main refueling tank of the transit station in preparation for removing the engine module and then deorbiting it. There we are, we've got the fuel transferred, and now let's get ready to undock here. Make sure that we've got things proper. There we go. Okay. So again, we don't have RCS capability on the engine tank, but that's okay. We just turn ourselves ever so slightly, and let's give ourselves just a slight boost on the engine. Again, you don't want to overthrust and cause the space station behind it to tumble around from the backwash of the engine. Now, as you can see, we're down to about 30 units of fuel, and honestly, I'm not sure if we have enough fuel to deorbit this vehicle, but Let's give it a try. Let's see if we can send this thing down to the surface of the Mun and clear the spaceways for future spacecraft. And looks like we're doing this. Excellent. Okay. So we pretty much drained all the fuel in that tank, so now we just go back to our transit station. Now, as you can see, it's a pretty basic station. Fortunately, though, we've got plenty of docking ports, and we can always attach future modules onto the spacecraft if need be. But for now, its primary role is to dock landers and shuttles. And with an altitude of 20 kilometers, this will be our lowest orbiting station in our fleet. Perfect to be used as a waypoint for sending in landers in case we need a median whereby to send crew between the base on the surface of the Mun and into space. And now, with our transit station and our fuel depot established around the Mun, we now confirm this mission complete. I'd like to thank you all for watching. This episode has been Minimalist approved, and we will see you next time.